for coming. My name is Michael Egan. I teach in the history department and in the arts and science program here at McMaster, and I've been running this McMaster rolling seminar this year. This is the fourth in our series and the first one for the winter semester. Please get in touch if you're interested in more of these. We're still trying to work out the schedule for the winter term. We've got a number of things planned, but nothing yet written down in stone. We're hoping to do a screening of Rising from the Ashes, the story of the Rwanda national cycling team. It's a new documentary. It's very exciting. We're hoping to do a couple of roundtables and a couple of conversation pieces and possibly some more interactive activities through the series as well. And if I could, before I introduce our speaker today, make one more pitch. I've been asked to comment or let you know about a documentary launch. It's going to be happening at Café Domestique in Dundas on the 8th, on the Saturday, the February 9th. A local group has been putting together a documentary series called How to Win Paris Ancaster, which is a multi-part documentary web series showcasing how former national cyclocross champion Mike Garrigan, average weekend hobbyist Jason Dejoux, and complete cycling novice and newbie Laurie Stewart prepare for Canada's Spring Cycling Classic, which rides from Paris just out here on roads, gravel, mud, rivers to Ancaster. The launch party, there'll actually be two launch parties, one in Toronto at Jet Fuel Coffee on Friday, February 8th, and another here in Dundas at Café Domestique on February 9th. Come check it out. I understand that they've got some history prof MC. I'm going to have to look into who that is later. But today I'm really excited, and actually this is sort of a special pleasure in a lot of ways as well, to be introducing and welcoming not just a colleague but also a friend, Dr. James Longhurst from the University of Wisconsin, La Crosse. I was explaining to my children the other day that Jim and I went to grad school together, although we didn't. But we kept running into each other at conferences for several years at respective graduate schools, sharing similar interests, which is going back at least a decade, we worked out last night. So, Dr. Longhurst is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. His interests are mostly related to urban environmental policy in the 20th century US, particularly when it comes to public involvement in policy decisions. He's a graduate from the History and Policy PhD program at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this approach is meant to provide historical research and analysis that is useful in understanding, contextualizing, and critiquing current policy problems and solutions. His doctoral dissertation research focused on the rise of local environmental organizing in the United States and Pittsburgh in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The project used one environmental organization, which I still think has the best name or acronym of any environmental organization I've come across, Pittsburgh's Group Against Smog and Pollution, or GASP, as a case study of the impact of new federal legislation and judicial philosophy on local organizing, implementation, and enforcement. The dissertation was subsequently published as Citizen Environmentalists. I'll actually pass that around and let you all have a go. Available or published in 2010 by Tufts University. Since finishing that book, Dr. Longhurst has begun work on a new research project examining the failures of practical bicycle commuting in U.S. cities in the 20th century and the difficulties faced by federal and state policies intended to promote bicycle usage in the 21st century. This research has resulted in a series of public presentations and a number of works in progress or in press, including a book manuscript titled The Bike in the City, under contract with the University of Washington Press and expected in 2014. In addition to this, Dr. Longhurst is also a cycle commuter for several years, a cycling and pedestrian advocate, a road cyclist most interested in century rides, and apparently a mediocre recreational triathlete eyeing half-iron distances. So if you please join me in welcoming Dr. James Longhurst.
Thank you very much. I just want to sort of make some announcements that I'm a very informal person. I'm absolutely happy to take questions during this presentation. We want to try to constrain this presentation to 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then have time for Q&A. I'm also absolutely willing, and if you have questions about something that I'm saying doesn't make sense, please have the discussion then. I'm not going to be reading a paper because I find that hugely boring. So you have time to ask a question. You won't throw me off. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll say during the 10 years or more that Mike Egan and I have known each other and met each other at every conference for environmental historians, he has never had the same facial hair twice during that, and so I just want to point that out. Right, here's the deal. I want to talk about the current problem, the fact that there is a crisis in cycling and urban cycling in North America, and a political fight. I want to ask the question about what I, as an environmental historian, and the particular interest I have, can possibly do to contribute to thinking about that problem. And then I want to offer one contribution I have. This contribution is one part of the research that I've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years now, seeking out untold episodes, moments in cycling history that can inform our current cycling debate that haven't had as much attention paid to them. And my example today is the first thing that I discovered when I started doing research on cycling. And the thing that I think is my best discovery, the side path movement, which is a largely forgotten moment in cycling history, which I believe is instructive. And I'd also like to sort of prep you by asking you to think about offering your own reflections on what we can learn about side paths at the end of this. Because I know I've done the research about side paths. I'm interested in what people are going to say when they have this background that hasn't been a part of our cycling debate so far. So I want to get right into it, and there's no sugarcoating this whatsoever. We have to start with Rob Ford. And here is then Councilman Rob Ford, a quote that appeared in, and other quotes have appeared in cycling press and elsewhere. And I want to talk about how this quotation is both wrong and right. And Councilman Ford has at least 2 clear points here that are correct. The components of this statement, particularly that roads are built for buses, cars, and trucks, not for people on bikes. The component of that's wrong, that historians will easily tell you is wrong, is that for perhaps the 5,500 years of human history, roads were not built for cars. Roads have existed for the vast majority of human civilization on planet Earth, and they're built for pedestrians, animals, and animal-drawn vehicles. Roads existed for 5,400 years before automobiles, so clearly they cannot have been built for cars. The other part of why he's wrong here is that even the narrowly constrained definition of modern paved urban roads, those roads also were not built for cars. And historians know, and have known for quite some time, and have written quite a bit about how the change in political structure that paved roads in North America and in the UK and elsewhere, what we call the good roads movement of the late 19th and early 20th century also happened before automobiles. Roads were not built for automobiles, and neither were roads originally paved for automobiles. They were instead paved for farmers, for cyclists who performed a lot of the political heavy lifting to support the good roads reform and how to pave the roads, and as means to clean up dirty cities, not for automobiles. And these good roads existed, paved roads existed before automobiles could have ever been popular. And as the historian Clay McShane has pointed out, they made cars possible. This is why Rob Ford is wrong. Why Rob Ford is right is a little more narrowly defined. Because Rob Ford is correct. Since the roads were paved throughout most of the 20th century, roads became infrastructure designed around automobiles, to the point that they excluded both pedestrians and cyclists and others. So before the 20th century, roads were built for horses, horse-drawn vehicles, bicycles, automobiles, omnibuses, trolleys, farmers' carts, strollers, trams, everything that's imaginable. But throughout the 20th century, roads became more and more exclusively designed for cars, to the point that reintroducing bicycles today into these streets is exceptionally dangerous, as I'm certain some of us know specifically. So Rockford is both wrong and right, and I want to come back to how this wrong and right shapes our present at the end of this. So I want to get through a little bit of the current boom and why there's a crisis happening. By all measurements, we have a boom in practical urban cycling. Not simply recreational, not simply competitive, which also might be undergoing a boom, but cycling within cities for practical purposes. I sometimes call it utilitarian for useful purposes. Here's some data that ended in 2009, put together by one of the great researchers in present day. Here's more recent stuff going up to 2011 with the crazy 257% growth rate of Portland, Oregon. But also, deeply unlikely, Washington, D.C. has not been a cycling mecca in the recent past, and is now. The growth rate in these cities is quite remarkable. Here's the Washington Post currently writing, recreational and competitive cycling have soared in the 21st century, and the utilitarian, the number of people commuting by bike is estimated to have increased by 43% since 2000. This is true in the US, this is true in Canada, this is true in the UK, and this is true in selected places in Europe.
I was just curious about the last slide there with Minneapolis. They seem to have kind of a weird
Yes.
draw here.
I can explain that. Thank you very much for bringing that up. This is a percent growth rate.
So just
Minneapolis cycling advocates believe there's actually not any more ability to grow in that. They've actually grown so much in the past. And the Twin Cities lags only Portland, Oregon in the United States for total percentage of cycling commuters. So this is not a reason to be concerned.
They just reached kind of a
A carrying capacity of their existing culture. But a good question. I get to come back to the Twin Cities at the end of it. So this is happening worldwide. Some of this is happening, and by the way, if any of you would like a research project, the causation of this boom is open to interpretation. We're not entirely certain. My favorite explanation for the United States is the economic depression since 2008. We see increased bicycle commuting, particularly among young people who have evinced less interest in public opinion polls in owning automobiles than any other previous generation of American teenagers. So my interpretation is economic downturn, but I believe there's also arguments that may be made for the push-pull of urban design, allowing for more bike lanes. I'm not actually certain, so if anyone likes a senior research topic. You can see this in a number of ways. There's a boom in popular books such as this, advocating both bicycle commuting and documenting its existence. So the surge is there, but with the surge has come some incredible conflict. It is certainly not seamless. The addition of bicycle lanes quite logically in most cities means the subtraction of either parking or travel lanes. And in a shared resource such as the public road, every time someone wins, someone else perceives themselves to be losing. So the political battle has been phenomenal. The reporting mostly here about New York City, but including Chicago, LA, Las Vegas, Madison fights, and this is one thing, and the reporting is one thing, but the opinion pages are even worse. I quote here, this is a P.J. O'Rourke column, Urban Cyclists Go Play in Traffic. Some quotations. In New York City, perhaps the most heated place for this conflict outside of the UK. Quote, the bike lane wars have become front page fodder, unquote. Battles range from cyclists on the Brooklyn Bridge, battles between hipsters and Hasidic Jews in Williamsburg, Prospect Park West's baby stroller battle over a bike lane, and accusations that Transportation Commissioner Jeanette Sadiq-Khan is carrying water for, quote, an invasion of socialist-leaning, Eurocentric, limp-wristed Lycra warriors, unquote. One former bike shop owner in New York City has declared that, quote, the level of emotional and psychological damage wrought by the bicycle far exceeds the damage done by cars. It is homegrown terrorism. The cumulative effect is equivalent to what happened on 9/11. I can't believe he went there. This is the fight of New York City, and New York City being a media center has heavily reported this. So there's some incredible press coming out of this, some of which may be a fair bit overblown, like the previous quotation. This is a photo illustration, not an actual incident. But I think we can find sort of evidence of this conflict in a lot of places. New York City is a great example, but the international example, beyond the US, perhaps even more instructive, because it's happening at the same time. There must be pressures behind this that are all bringing this to bear at the same time. Toronto, its war on cycling. There's way back to Mayor Ford and his war on bikes. And of course the Jarvis Street bike lane removal, this guy sitting in front of the... but beyond that, also in San Francisco, and the enormous protests and perhaps sensationalistic coverage in the UK. I do want to pause here and, oh, that was Mexico City. I do want to pause here and point out, as a cyclist and as a realist and somebody who would like to solve this problem, that there's a minor possibility that cyclists are assholes. It's not the entirety of the explanation. I also do not want to declare a pox on all their houses and say it's all equally unfair. But it's also true that attempts to integrate the bicycle into an auto-centric city are made difficult by laws that favor bicycles, laws that favor automobiles, infrastructure that favors automobiles, a majority car culture. And because of all of those things, cyclists used to not following laws that are not seemingly written for them and are illogical for cyclists. Because of that, because of many, many things, I do want to make it clear that cyclists occasionally have exacerbated this issue themselves, as well as the class differences. So this kind of, if I've convinced you that a cycling conflict is occurring, I kind of want to transition here to the question of what can historians possibly contribute to this question.
Sorry, it's a brief aside, but what do you think about able to stop laws as a solution to that?
Well, certainly, bicycle advocates have a list of possible changes to existing law that can better accommodate cycles. I think of vulnerable user laws are very important. I think that passing lane laws are very important. The so-called Idaho stop, so the rolling stop for cyclists, is important. But we're talking about systematic design of an auto-centric city and legal edifice. So small changes to a single law are merely that, small changes. This is going to be a very long process if it can be successful to integrate multiple kinds of traffic. Is that kind of vaguely helpful? That's the way historians think, is they think systematically in large-scale infrastructure, which sometimes leads to dissatisfying things that historians' favorite response to every question is, well, it's complicated. So, I mean, what can historians tell us about this, this current conflict? It's strange for a historian to stand in front of you and start the research with the present. It is not a comfortable place for historians to talk about their research directly affecting current policy. It's not what historians generally wish to do. And it's one of the strange roles that I have as a policy historian. I particularly want to explain the present with the past. It makes me deeply uncomfortable, in fact, because I'm sort of out there on a ledge in some cases. And I don't want to say that historians haven't written about bicycling before. They certainly have. Historians have, for a very long time, written a number of very interesting things about the 1890s, about the League of American Wheelmen. The Good Roads movement has been very heavily covered. Professional cycling and its development in its early years has been very heavily covered. The technology of bicycles has been a huge battle within science and technology circles, and that's really been very heavily covered. And some other minor topics that have been covered. The thing that's different about these new approaches, and I do want to say I'm an urban environmental policy historian that focuses on the 20th century. This is the particular interest I have. As Mike has pointed out, this is the research I've done about environmentalism as a movement and the legal and political infrastructure that allows social movements to change large systems. The environmental movement in the United States, as I have argued elsewhere, should be thought of not simply as a social or philosophical phenomenon, but also something about changing fundamental laws in a democracy. And that's, I think, what urban environmental and policy historians can do coming to bicycle history. To talk about things that are not exactly on the surface, not the bicycles themselves, not professional cycling, but the laws that underpin the way that cycles and automobiles have been treated on the road. So I want to give you my example of that with the side path politics of the 1890s, and then I'm going to get you guys' input and what you think about this. So this great example that I have about what historians could basically add to our current conflict, or our understanding and solution of that current conflict, begins with history we already know. The golden age of cycling in the United States, an unprecedented boom in the popularity of bicycling from really roughly 1890-ish to just after the turn of the century. And this is a bicycling fad in multiple sense of the word. It's based upon a variety of things. A fad for exercise in an industrializing world. An increased opportunity of middle-class families to pay for luxury and amenities and vacation time. And this has been documented in a variety of ways. I do like to point out the importance of technology, not as a cause, or only the central cause of the 1890s bicycle boom, but certainly something without which it could not occur, and that's the safety bicycle itself. Named for the fact that it's not going to kill you, like the large wheel bone shakers of previous fads. The safety is, in many ways, recognizable to us today as a bicycle we could ride. It has the arrangements of frame, same size wheels, seat over the rear, steering, and in fact, this is basically the hipster's coffee shop fixie of 2013. It is a fixed gear, no derailleur bike. Also no brake. But it's it's largely impossible for the bike boom to occur without the pneumatic tires, without this steering geometry, which opens up cycling to men and women both. Its simplicity of construction, aided with developments in mass production, make it less expensive, affordable even by children of a certain class, and rideable in a fairly short amount of time of training. Please ignore the horrible racial stereotypes scattered beneath the as the French winged goddess brings the bicycle to the world. She does so. Right. Anyway, so the great limiting factor of this bicycle boom of the 1890s is not the cost of the bicycles, it's not the technology of the bicycles, it's not the difficulty of riding, it is the roads are crap. And in the 1890s, both urban and rural roads are largely unpaved. The reason they are unpaved is not simply technology, it's cost. And who pays for paving before the Good Roads movement is what really limits the ability of anyone to ride. All right, I'm going to play classroom professor. Does anyone know who pays to pave and maintain the roads before 1900? Who pays?
The property owner.
Right, the property owner who lives right against that piece. Right. As we say, the abutters pay. And those who live on it go.
What about intersections?
Say it louder.
What about intersections?
So, yes, interesting. Who pays for that? I'm not joking. It's paid for those who live closest. And those who live closest can choose to, in cities, club together and choose the type of paving material. Is it stone? Is it petroleum-soaked wood, which is quite a common thing? Is it finely crushed gravel? Is it a lane of finely crushed gravel and a lane of dirt? Quite often within cities, the abutters choose what is paved, although there's some attempt by cities to enforce a decision, but is then paid for by the cities. And outside of the cities, basically no one pays. Everyone within American counties is required to donate time or donations of teams of animals or tools to prepare the roads that are closest to them. It's under the control of a county pathmaster is the name, and the resulting roads are a disaster. They're poorly engineered, they're not planned out, they're not drained, they're generally just dirt, and the usual choice that pathmasters have to repair roads is just to pile up dirt in the center of the road and hope it gets pushed down by the people who come over. So before the 19th century, before the Good Roads movement, states, provinces, municipalities, they generally do not pay for or control who paves the roads. Roads are not paved out of a general tax of everyone that uses them. They're only paid for by those who live close to them. And the result is a disaster. This is the League of American Wheelmen, who very early on become Good Roads proponents, a reform movement in multiple countries to try to change the quality of the roads based on who pays for them. The roads are a disaster. This is an object lesson roads, not a great scam, but kind of roads we want. They're compact, they're level. Kind of roads we find, they're muddy, they get your team stuck, and this guy his wheels are completely encrusted in mud. Mark Twain probably said it best. He might not have said this, but he probably said it this best, and it was written down that if he ever went to hell, he hoped he would go by a bad road because at least he would be glad when he got there. So, the LAW, the League of American Wheelmen, both promotes good roads, and they get a little confused about this. There's some complexity going to come up. But before the good roads movement changed the way that roads were paid for, there was an attempt to start building paths for cyclists alone. And in the late 1890s, what we had was the creation of recreational roads built by cycling clubs quite often. And this path in towards White Bear Lake in St. Paul, Minnesota, you see it's on the cover of the LAW Bulletin and Good Roads. And it is a bicycle path, perhaps 5 to 6 feet wide, gravel packed, paid for voluntarily by bicycle riders clubbing together and building a recreational path. These paths appeared in Boston, Denver, throughout much of New York and Philadelphia, and New York, Pennsylvania. They're fairly popular, but they're quite limited because they're just based on the bicycle club group coming together and paying for them. They also just go by themselves across fields. They don't follow roads. They don't go useful places like from where you live to where you work. They go from where you live to where you would like to recreation and picnic. So these roads, these paths are quite limited. And this is where the side path movement really begins. Because the people who liked building these bicycle paths started agitating to create a different way to fund them. This is a short-lived movement, maybe a decade-ish. And it happens before the Good Roads movement is successful and towards the tail end of the bicycle boom. The originator here is Charles T. Raymond, known as the father of the side path, from Lockport, near Niagara Falls, Niagara County. And what he does is exceptionally important because it both spells the success and kind of the doom of the side path movement. Niagara County begins building paths for bicycles alongside roads paid for by a general tax. They write a county law which taxes everyone within the county who owns a bicycle. The county takes that money and starts building a network of paths along all of the roads. And they actually are immensely successful, so much so that other counties start wishing to do the same thing. In upstate New York, the western corner of New York, starts building these paths on their own. This is described as a tax, bicycle tax. Charles T. Raymond, father of the side path movement, first man to pay the Niagara County tax. I had no idea how they forced people to pay this tax. I know it's paid through the county assessor. And the journalists report it as being people cheerfully, I don't know anybody who cheerfully pays a tax, but they say that people cheerfully pay the tax. And it's successful. But when the model of Niagara's success moves to the next county over, to Monroe County, it fails spectacularly. Monroe County hates the idea of taxation. And this is the fight at the center of the side path movement that both makes it interesting to me and makes it a failure. The editor of the Monroe Post-Express claims that cyclists, quote, regard the tax as an outrage as it unfairly allowed cycle path riders to reap substantial benefits at the expense of others, including women and children. They call this the vicious principle of class taxation. Quote, there is no more reason why the bicyclist should be taxed for cinder paths than that owners of vehicles should be taxed for the construction of better highways. Here's another 20,000 wheel owners ought not to be taxed for the benefit of a few hundred, argued the newspapers. The Post-Express is describing an opinion that is widely held at the time, that taxing everybody for the benefit of a small number is philosophically objectionable. Here is a county resident, Franklin Smith. He wrote to a nationally known magazine, a long story, just slagging on all of his opponents in this Monroe County battle. He's not against the side paths themselves, he's a cyclist. But he's against the political philosophy of taxation. Citing Herbert Spencer, a prominent proponent of social Darwinism, he notes that Herbert Spencer's social philosophy teaches that the improvement shall be undertaken voluntarily by those alone that desire it. What it forbids is that they should ever resort to the argument of coercion to secure the aid of others. And with this, Monroe defeats the idea of general taxation to huge acclaim, and instead starts building their side paths by voluntarily raised money. Here they have a Callithumpian parade of bicyclists to raise money for the paths. And so from that example, when Charles Raymond went to go write a New York statewide law, he said, well, taxation isn't going to work. So instead replaced it with the user fee model. Side paths would be built. Only people with a side path tag could ride upon them. And side path tags would be voluntarily purchased. It is a user fee model. And this is New York's 1899 law, which is slightly modified in 1900. It does a couple of interesting things. It allows any county judge, upon the petition of 50 wheelmen of the county, to appoint a commission, each of whom shall be a cyclist, and that these commissioners are authorized to construct and maintain side paths along any public road or street. The proposed paths were not to be less than 3 feet or more than 6 feet wide, constructed within the outside lines and along upon either side of such public roads and streets. This model of side path building is hugely popular, both in New York, throughout the US, and into Canada. The 20 New York counties eventually start building paths. Some of them are huge, some of them are tiny. Monroe County builds 150 miles of paths by 1900. Niagara County, quite likely more than 200, all those conflicting counts. Maryland, Ohio, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Florida, Minnesota all pass laws on the New York model. A couple more states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Wisconsin, they all come really close. A couple other states pass laws based on the general taxation model. So Oregon and Pennsylvania pass laws but allow everybody to get thrown out. Their Supreme Courts throw them out fairly quickly. The side path commissions, I want to say just one quick note here. These are kind of a weird solution. They're quasi-state authorities. They're not actually the government itself. They are instead volunteers that are commissioned by government. And it's sort of a way to get around the fear of general taxation, because it's less about the government taking the force of taxation and more about volunteers collecting user fees. So it's a strange quasi-state. I also think it's part of why it fails eventually. More about its success. This is actually what they look like. The rare photographs of side paths in action. This is a residential street in Rochester, New York. And this is unpaved dirt road. You can see it's slightly rutted. So here's the road. Here is curbing. Here is a side path, compacted gravel. Here's actually a rider on the side path. here's a median of grass and trees, and here's a sidewalk. Sidewalks and side paths were not supposed to be the same thing.
Right, so two questions. First, so sidewalks already started separating vehicles from pedestrians, so when did that come in? And secondly, this solution is very similar to what the Netherlands ended up introducing in the late 1970s.
Absolutely.
And which was a reason for cycling there to go phenomenally.
Yeah, and it's a physically separated path, which makes it a distinct difference. So the question about sidewalks is fascinating, and I've done enough research to be able to talk a little bit about sidewalks, but I will tell you, sidewalks is another piece of history that no one's done.
Huh.
Sidewalks, like roads themselves, began as a requirement for property owners to build, and slowly over time, they go from that to governments require that you build, that eventually governments just assess you and they build it because they don't trust people to build them themselves. And in many instances now what we have in new suburbs and construction, they're required that the developer build before the municipality ever comes in. But sidewalks actually had appeared in many American cities as early as the 1870s and 1860s, certainly. So they were really already in existence in Rochester and Buffalo and elsewhere where these were appearing. Did I answer?
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that this occurs when sort of the design of the urban space is still a little fluid, that there's space for something to be inserted. Well, in the Netherlands, they come quite a bit later.
Yeah.
Here's another example. This is in Monroe County, and we have the path to right, road on left. And here, as in the previous image, the path is better surfaced than the road. The road has not yet been paved, which is the entire purpose for the path existing. And so therefore the paths are alongside in the same right-of-way legally, but actually better. This is actually a toll gate where the person driving on the road was required to pay a toll, and this was where they checked side path tags to make certain that you had them legally. This is the explosion of side paths in Monroe County and elsewhere. These lines are just roads upon which or near which side paths exist. And you can see an incredible radial structure developing, allowing one to go both to downtown Rochester, to recreational sites, and then connecting the city to the county. The tags themselves have continued to exist. They pop up on eBay. If you would like to buy me one, please do so. They're like $50. I don't have that kind of money to throw away. They pop up from time to time. They're quite often, when they appear in museums, they're incorrectly listed as bicycle licenses, as in a license to drive on a public street. That's a completely different means of raising money. That's not the same thing at all. So county after county. Here's where I'll point out that the province of Ontario had a side path law. They actually had two different ones. One in 1897, which allowed cycle paths to be built but did not apportion any money for them. And guess what? They didn't get built. And then one written on the New York model after 1900. I know that Manitoba also had one. I have not done any research beyond the fact that the laws existed. In many of the places that I know the laws existed, I don't actually know that paths got built or tags were created and sold. So if anyone wants to do that research, go do it. This leaves me with St. Paul, the story of St. Paul and Minneapolis, Minnesota, which outside of New York became the greatest success stories. And not only do St. Paul and Minneapolis build cycle paths, and again we have that same radial structure of paths, both outside of the city and then connecting Minneapolis to St. Paul, making them the twin cities before paved roads ever connect them. But those roads, those paths actually continue to exist in the twin cities where they are erased elsewhere. It's somewhat accidental, and it's a completely different paper that I've written for a different outline, but different audience, but these paths, these radial lines, continue to exist in Minneapolis-St. Paul where they cross into parks. And elsewhere in New York and elsewhere, these paths are erased after 1905. They continue to exist in the Twin Cities because of the complex nature of the park systems there, the parkways. And if you go to the Twin Cities today, you can in fact ride on paths that were once paid for as cycle paths. This map is a little confusing. It's written this way, but it should be ignored that way. But this is Minneapolis, and this is another network of cycle paths. So I've sort of given away the end point. This, by the way, another cycle path in the Twin Cities, and a horribly rutted, crappy road right next to it. And this is the city engineer in St. Paul, and Minneapolis both takes over building quite a number of these paths, which is another reason why they succeeded, building them again alongside of existing roads. And this is somewhat hard to see, but this is actually a city engineering work crew tossing out gravel to pack tightly. The high point of this, the immense dream of 1900-1901, is sidepath advocates think, hey, if we get every single county to build their own piece, we can create an interstate highway of bicycle-specific paths across America. And they think, in fact, that they're going to be able to do it within the next 5 years. This is League of American Wheelmen writing in 1900, proclaiming that within 5 years this country will possess a system of side paths that will extend almost everywhere. The trunk lines, the paths intended to connect the centers of population, even at great distances, will connect first the Twin Cities to Chicago, and here's the first dream, Minneapolis, St. Paul, down through Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, to Madison, to Milwaukee, and down to Chicago, and from there, eastward, is the first step. And they're imagining this is going to be done within the next 2 to 5 years, but the first step will be completed in the next year. Despite the fact that this Chicago-New York path will be nearly 1,000 miles in length, they said the path is practically assured. And here's the dream. Oh boy. For cyclists at least, there will soon be a transcontinental highway that will cast a shadow upon the touring possibilities of England and Europe, and with branches of the LAW working in every state. The limit to the mileage of paths which may be constructed under its auspices in the near future will be fixed by nothing but its needs and intelligent and enthusiastic cooperation. It fails. The first failure is that Wisconsin does not pass its own statewide side path law. So they have to change the route from Minneapolis-St. Paul, rather than going from Wisconsin, through Wisconsin, to dip ever further south and eventually to Chicago and elsewhere. But it also fails that because outside of upstate New York and the Twin Cities, a little bit in Chicago and some limited places elsewhere, side paths never reach the dreams of their greatest supporters. The Minneapolis Journal here describing in 1904 the erasure of some of these. It's the great success of the Good Roads movement that takes care of the rest of the side paths. Because the side paths are built in the road right-of-way. When the Good Roads movement succeeds in getting state funding for paving, the road is simply widened. And where side paths were before is just paved over, is just included in the good roads that are paved after. And you can see this pretty clearly. Here is Monroe County, and here's that radial network we had, and here is a good roads map of just a small number of years later, and the places where roads are being paved is that same radial network of side path roads. So where side paths existed, they are paved over, and cyclists are, at the time, very happy to have that happen, because paved roads and a wide network of them is what they wanted all along. This is sort of the end of my discussion, and the question of what do we learn from knowing that the side path movement existed and failed. And I have a short list of points that I have from this and what we learn. One of the first things we learn is that this is a reminder that the public roads today that we have are shared space. They're shared by multiple users. And cyclists' support for paved roads came after they had given up on their dream of creating a separate network. However brief the side path movement existed, it was a belief in creating a separate network that then cyclists gave up on and threw in their lot with everyone else in creating a shared space. So when we say share the road now, we're actually saying something we've been saying for a very long time. This is a shared public resource that cyclists committed to. One of the other lessons I have from this is that infrastructure without funding is nothing. The stability of infrastructure funding is life or death for infrastructure. And when the cycling fad of the 1890s faded, the volunteer effort of side paths, essentially making them user fee only, making them based upon the volunteer effort of side path commissioners, that simply eroded. Where there was no government institution to take responsibility, the side path simply disappeared. And as a historian, I have to say, it is wicked hard to find this stuff, because side path commissions were run by cyclists out of their homes, not by city engineers out of their offices. City engineers' records get kept. A cycling advocate records at home, they're gone. So there's very little in terms of documentary evidence of these side path commissions, outside of the laws, outside of the tags, and outside of the maps. The last 2 points I have is the discussion of the public. This debate over paying taxes and who should contribute to public good came at a pivotal moment in the definitions of the public good. Public education had just won its argument in the United States. Public roads were going to win their argument in just a couple of years. But right in that middle bit, the idea that cyclists, a small group of technological elite who can afford recreation and leisure time, the idea that cyclists and the public were the same thing was not acceptable in political discourse. It was impossible to make those two groups the same thing. And eventually the LAW quit trying. They continued to advocate for good roads, but they stopped talking about cyclists and just made it a good roads reform for the good of all. In fact, they split their magazine, the LAW Bulletin, and Good Roads into two and made them two different arguments, dropping cyclists from the equation. And my last point is about us today. Because I don't know about you, but I would like to have that. I would very much like to have a network of bicycle-specific roads. And I think I leave this with the question about the impact of fairly small infrastructural decisions upon what we can do in our daily lives that transform how we live sustainably in the 21st century. That I don't have a path, and by the way, I live for much of my time in upstate New York and the rest of my time in Wisconsin. I live in places that once built these paths and they no longer exist. And it's sort of interesting to me to know that that option is closed off for me, in some ways because of an accident of history. Because if the side path movement had come 5 years later, it's possible that the definition of public could have been slightly more expansive. And I would not have to fear for my life as I ride to work today. That's it for me. Thank you very much for your time. I'd love for Q&A or people cheering me up about the environmental sustainability of this matter.
Well, I guess reflecting on the current weather, how did they deal with winter's riding conditions? Is there any?
Yes. Particularly applicable to Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yeah.
The side path movement was very seasonal, and they began selling side path tags in the spring and doing work on these paths in the spring. Gravel, in fact, is no matter how well compressed, ruts quite badly in the winter, and in wet weather. So these were 3-season paths. If that answers your question. It's somewhat depressing to read the newspaper stories and come back every March and read the same newspaper story. Today, this year, we're going to make the side paths even better.
You spoke about an 1897 side path law in Ontario.
Yep.
Was there any more done about that in Ontario?
Glenn Norville. The book is called Ride to Modernity.
Right.
Has reference to it. I will say path building and the side path movement in particular has been something that historians have missed. And Glenn Norville, like many others, have concentrated on the social impact, and then the social story of the 1890s is, these are social groups, and they exist for a lot of reasons having to do with social class and demography. So he has more to do with the technology, the commerce, and the social groups, but he does make mention of 1897 law and the subsequent Ontario law.
What was the subsequent one?
The 1897 law is not based on the New York model. It simply allows paths to be built but has no financing function. Mm-hmm. The subsequent law, which I believe is 1900, is based on the New York model and has that same path tag user fee structure. The Ontario law was called a cycle path law rather than a side path law, but it was on the same law.
Okay.
Oh.
I was just wondering, so in your discussion and the connections that you're drawing sort of between past and present,
Yes.
there seemed to be this I guess friction between like sort of cycling advocates, side path advocates and politicians. But I'm wondering, in a more contemporary context, there actually are examples of political will to create bike lanes. So I'm just wondering why there wasn't any discussion of the advantages for politicians to advocate for bike paths, and like one being that there's a growing sort of environmental movement, a growing number of people that participate in cycling. Mm-hmm. But additionally, there's a practical level to it where widening the roads increases their longevity, because as the temperatures fluctuate and roads sort of develop cracks and stuff like that, having bike paths will allow, you don't have to replace the roads as quickly because there's more usable road. So I just didn't sense any discussion. It seemed that there was always this antipathy between politicians and cyclists rather than collaboration.
And in the present, there's some really significant collaboration. There are mayors, particularly in Seattle, I know, for example, I think maybe Vancouver and Portland and other mayors who have just thrown their lot completely behind shared use goals. And that's true, and I could certainly acknowledge that, but it makes for a better fight when I just talk about the contrary. But it is inevitably true, and there are lots of reasons that city politicians have become hugely supportive of we call complete streets philosophy, redesigning streets to encourage safety for pedestrians and cyclists together. What's interesting to me, and this is another research topic, is the difference between municipal politicians and state, province, national level. In the US, our federal level funding that trickles down we're not quite certain exactly how it's been cut. We don't know how the devil is in the details, but it's been significantly cut. MAP 21 is going to cut the amount of money that seems to be available on the local level for bicycle infrastructure in the next 2 years. And that's a really strange thing to be happening at this moment where there's this really this boom in actual cycling on the city level. So I believe that there's a disconnect between mayors. Yeah.
I wonder how much of this is just building on that geographical as well, where I've been sort of.
I was saying Vancouver, Seattle, Portland.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah, no,
And I, having sort of thought about the Vancouver experience specifically, which was really not a very cycling-friendly city until less than 5 years ago. And it fits in this model, this boom you've been talking about, but hasn't been experiencing the kind of economic recession that so much of, well, the rest of the continent has been. In ways, and with a mayor who's very much on board, similar to Seattle and Portland. I'm wondering just whether they're.
But economics are still changing. You know,
Well,
changing from industry to service industry and the high-tech, higher education hospitals, the 3 H's of employment. Those 3 H's, they can be located anywhere, and so therefore cities must compete in terms of some other models. It's quite often it comes down to livability for people who can be mobile and work for a hospital here or a hospital here or a hospital here. Which one has the better quality of life?
Yeah, so
I think right, exactly. I think that cities that are competing for non-industrial service industry are more committed to competing for quality of life questions. And if that comes down to
nice.
painting some green boxes on the road, that's a fairly inexpensive investment. There's a question here. No, you can't remember it.
Well, okay, it was tied to, I guess, timelines again. I mean, you mentioned that had this happened 5 years later, it could be a different story.
Which is a crazy counterfactual. You know, I'm just uncomfortable as a historian playing with a counterfactual. But I do believe this is a strange discussion of what didn't occur.
Well, it's interesting. You didn't speak much about the automobile boom that would have driven some of the political will to publicly fund some of these roads. I mean, in the early 20th century there, as you started having more cars around, maybe you can tie it to economic factors of people driving cars,
Right.
a bigger push to get these roads built.
See, and I'm relying a lot on the work of the historian Clay McShane, but also Chris Wells, who I don't know if you've read. Okay, so there's another book coming out now called Car Country, which is going to be our first sort of really big narrative history of cars. And the research they've done really carefully points to the fact that the successful changes in the laws that pave the roads happened years before the popularity of the automobile. And we're talking really 5 to 10 years.
So was there not like the good road, like the people involved in the cycling movement that were after roads? I mean, they had a table at the GOP. They were important political force.
Right.
But
and this is interesting statement sort of talk to you. A lot of the cyclists here are in the 1890s are upper middle class professional males, and so by and large, and quite a few of the cyclists are politicians, are jurists, and are quite involved in this. Yes.
The same as it was in the UK. It was the same. They were a very strong political force that kind of just disappeared almost.
Right.
As the popularity of the sport disappeared, I guess. Right.
As the popularity, as a fad faded. And,
yeah.
But it's also a choice. The historian Michael Fein, F-E-I-N, has written a book about the Good Roads movement in New York State. And he's very clearly identified when, as early as 1902, the LAW looks at its rhetoric and says, we want good roads. The people that we have to agree with, including farmers and those who represent farmers, don't like cyclists. And so therefore we are going to disconnect our argument, our rhetoric for good roads, from our rhetoric as cycling advocates, and let those two movements live on their own. It sort of erases the actions that cyclists had there. I have a counterfactual I want to toss back at you, but did that kind of...
Yeah, no, I just sort of wanted to speak to the gentleman's point about the fact that they were quite a powerful lobby group, and they were...
Yes, no, the LAW, and, you know, well, I mean, they're doing an amazing thing, which is convincing Americans to tax themselves, which doesn't happen a lot. And they succeed in really an amazing way, in a way we forget to think about anymore. We're like, well, that's the road. Well, who built it? Well, it's always, no, you built it. It's based on. The counterfactual I want to offer, and I've written about elsewhere, the reason I'm fascinated by these sort of radial images of cycle paths in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The red here, by the way, all cycle paths, except for the dotted lines, which are streetcar lines. Is I kind of think about the counterfactual. So this is 1900 in St. Paul. What if that network had continued to exist throughout the 20th century? What if, when the suburbs came along after World War II, they were built and were connected back down to the center city core in a number of North American cities by walking and bicycle paths? So if these had sort of accidentally been allowed to continue to exist in American cities, how would American history have been different? If one could bicycle from New York to the Midwest to California, how would the great migrations of the Great Depression have been different? How would the opportunities of the urban poor to connect themselves to the amenities of the suburbs and beyond and exurbs, how would that counterfactual history look if you could get around and in between North American cities by ways other than the car? And that's a strange counterfactual. My mind plays with that quite a bit. And it explains some of the weight that I lend to this momentary dream, which may or may not have existed beyond the minds of its most ardent supporters.
I've got two questions. One just very quickly on the map. Minneapolis, St. Paul, as sort of a second major urban center for cycling and cycle paths, side paths and things in the United States, then and now. A feature of the urban topography, byproduct of a larger demographic of Northern European extraction that are already attuned to cycling. I'm just trying to work out. Minneapolis seems too hot and too cold to be a...
So in 2010, Bicycling Magazine named the Twin Cities the #1 urban cycling center of the United States, which is crazy. It's really unpleasant there in the winter. And yet it's absolutely true, and this is a thing that we need to explain. And if you'd like an explanation of this, please read my article in the forthcoming book, Greater Minnesota, an environmental history, which is, we don't actually have a publisher for yet. So I've written an essay about this. And one of the things you didn't mention, but is true, it's not just about geography, and it's not just about climate, it's not just about ethnicity, it's about the politics of that ethnicity. And Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities, have a very interesting political history. Minnesota does not have a Democratic Party, did you know? It's a Democratic Farmer Labor Party, DFL. It has the, today, this is the 21st century, the remnants of a incredible populist movement and slightly more of a commitment to publicly owned utilities at the beginning of the 20th century. 1912, Minneapolis has a socialist party mayor. 1900, they have an incredible graft scandal, which puts them off private ownership of waterworks and public and utilities, and makes them more committed to the idea of public ownership of the parks. They created a massive park system, which is unlike anything else in the US. And also utilities. Their formation of these paths is much more controlled and funded by the cities than anything that happens in New York. And so that way these things can exist a little bit longer after the volunteer side path commissions just disappear. their city engineer is still building these paths into 1907, which is quite a bit longer. And they're selling side path tags out of the city treasurer's office until 1909, which is, you know, New York hasn't sold a side path tag by 5 years by that point in time. Did I?
So do you think that it continued to be maintained long after the side path commission was defunct because it did connect to useful places like parks, which were...
Well, I don't want to overbuild this.
Okay.
Because after about 1909, the paths outside of parks in the Twin Cities have been paved over. They've been successfully paved over. So these are major connecting routes between St. Paul, which is here, and Minneapolis, which is up here. And there's kind of two ways to do it. You can do it the quick route on a road, or the long route down to Fort Snelling and up. This route becomes part of parkland, which goes all the way along here. And that gets maintained through much of the 20th century, although there's fewer cyclists. But when cyclists reemerge after the 1970s, they just reappropriate that trail. This path right here has been paved over quite some long time ago. And by the 1970s, the cycling advocates have to come along and they say, I think we have a great idea. We should have an on-road lane there that's just for bicycles. And people are like, that's crazy. That's never happened. And in fact, they chose the exact same path that the side path had been on years before. So there's some complexity here. I think it's an accident of the fact that there are parks dotted around Minneapolis and St. Paul, and they developed what's called the parkway system. And parkways, you've been on a road that's called a parkway, right? You're on a highway and you're a boulevard and an avenue and a parkway. The parkway is supposed to have some greenery on it, and some of the parkways don't anymore. But the parkways are supposed to have some greenery, and maybe they're divided and they have trees and green in the middle. Well, Minneapolis and St. Paul built a parkway system before the Good Roads movement that connected all of their lakes and went around all of their lakes. And what happened is those bicycle paths that went alongside those parkways were maintained because those roads were maintained by the Parks Commission, which was not the same as the city engineer. So it's somewhat accidental in the case of the Twin Cities. More questions?
One last question there.
Sure, yeah, I was just wondering about traffic, population density, congestion, all of these issues, and how they factor into the bike lane debate, like both past and present, because it seems to me presently, a lot of the cities that are at the forefront of like bike lane advocacy, whether it be London, England, or Toronto, or New York, are all cities where it's a lot faster in many cases to travel by bike, to go downtown or wherever, than to try and drive, for example. And I was just wondering, in terms of how that relates to the past, how did they decide where to put these side paths? Was it a function of congestion or traffic, or was it sort of just to link to parks, or what was the determining factor?
Not congestion. Because some of these side paths are built in very dead little agricultural towns in upstate New York where not much is happening. Batavia, New York. And it's not congestion. It is the fact that in the 1890s, you would like to go to town. How do you get there? Well, hitching up a team of horses to your carriage that you may or may not own is a time-consuming, exhausting process. Riding a horse individually yourself, one would not do in the upper class because you cannot appear at work all sweaty, and riding a horse makes you sweaty. The limits for individual travel before the automobile allows individual travel actually make it quite difficult for you on a whim to quickly travel into town or out of town or to another place on your own without taking a horse and team with you. And that's expensive and it's difficult, and you have to have some place to put the horse and team, and you get there and it's annoying, and leaving your horse out front of the saloon, that's not a good idea. So in a way, the impetus is not avoiding congestion. The impetus is how can I individually travel where I wish to go on my own? And get there with a bike that I can lock up and, and it's more about individual travel for recreational and whimsical purposes. Whimsical is not the word. On whimsy. On your own choice.
Yeah.
Of your own volition.
Leisure.
Yeah. And I think that's much more in the present, I do like, as a historian, trying to choose my battles by making certain I'm on the side that's eventually going to win, either by demographics or time. And I think the present discussion we have is about increasing urbanization. And that is a trend that will continue. Our energy will become progressively more expensive. The ability to travel and consume vast amounts of energy at a whim will become more difficult. Cities will become more crowded. And cheap individual travel by bicycle, I think, is most likely going to be part of that future mix. So I think I'm on the side of time.
Well, that's optimistic.
I know! I never went with optimism.
Maybe that's where we should conclude. Please
Yes.
join me. Thank you, Dr. James Longhurst.